It has been over 6 months since my last MusclePharm bankruptcy update, but don't misinterpret that silence as somehow indicating the court proceedings must have been good vibes only. Regardless, it looks like this dark MusclePharm period is about to be officially over, and my avid followers likely recognize the acquirer. So I'll provide all of the details throughout this content to make sense of that introductory statement. But I first want to kind of run through a quick recap of what has happened thus far in the Muscle Farm bankruptcy era. All of the incremental strategic errors that compounded over the entire existence of Muscle Farm and led to its mid December filing for protection under Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Code is far too dense to even attempt summarizing. But the one critical pre bankruptcy decision that I will mention, and only because it's the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, was when Muscle Farm entered into a collateralized loan with a portion of the hedge fund Empery Asset Management. Since Muscle Farm would end up not being able to meet the terms of that debt, Empery became the owner of everything valuable at Muscle Farm, whether that was intellectual property or hard goods like inventory. As you can imagine, Empery had no desire to operate a sports nutrition brand and quickly put the intellectual property up for auction. On the date of that auction, it would end abruptly because then CEO and Chairman of MusclePharm Ryan Drexler ended up putting the company into bankruptcy protection. Wanting to obviously maximize its ROI on this new asset ownership situation, Empery had a vested interest in not letting Muscle Farm fall into Chapter 7, aka total liquidation bankruptcy, before the Chapter 11 reorganization process and auction could be completed. So, Empery provided Muscle Farm with a total of $7.2 million in debtor in possession or DIP financing to keep the sports nutrition brand operational for the last 10 or so months, plus over a million in factoring financing to keep inventory in stock. As mentioned in earlier pieces of Muscle Farm content, the previous largest shareholder, CEO, and chairman of Muscle Farm, Ryan Drexler, resigned, and supplement industry veteran Eric Hillman was tasked to stabilize the struggling company by helping sales revenue rebound in a post Costco era, persuade talent to pitch in his reorganization plan, and rebuild trust with supply side partners like contract manufacturers and ingredient suppliers. I'll detail how Eric Hillman performed over this last 10 or so months as MusclePharm CEO next, but let's first run through why this Chapter 11 bankruptcy process has taken so damn long. If you followed my Bang Energy bankruptcy content, you know that process took around 260 days, but it was complex, involving creditor claims in the billion-dollar range and had that infamous hostile takeover element to it as well. Surprisingly enough, the Muscle Farm bankruptcy has taken even longer, though with far less in creditor claims. Why? Well, that likely could be pointed in the direction of Ryan Drexler, even though almost all secured and unsecured creditors agreed on the proposed path forward for liquidating the remaining assets and value of Muscle Farm. Ryan Drexler took various legal actions against Empery and even a few of its employees for good measure, too. And this is understandably so, as Ryan Drexler put many millions of his own capital into Muscle Farm over the years. But back to that Empery collateralized loan that got Muscle Farm into this mess, there was a clause within the signed intercreditor insubordination agreement that, actually disallowed Ryan Drexler the ability to file legal challenges. Around the same time of these court battles, the SEC filed a settled complaint charging a collection of Muscle Farm executives for engaging in improper revenue recognition practices to achieve revenue growth demanded by its former CEO, Ryan Drexler. The defendants' misconduct allegedly inflated Muscle Farm's publicly reported quarterly revenues by as much as 25% and gross profits by as much as 49%. The SEC also separately charged Drexler with fraud in a litigated complaint that alleges, while CEO, he misled investors about the catastrophic impact of the company's default with institutional note holders and that he falsely certified that he evaluated the company's internal controls. But even with Ryan Drexler facing multiple court battles all at once, he kept battling to delay the MusclePharm bankruptcy auction that was scheduled for this current month of September after the investment bank Hilco was retained to seek a buyer. Well, let's just say the enforcement of that Empery agreement ended up happening, and the court approved the asset purchase and sale agreement for MusclePharm this past week. Before I disclose who acquired the sports nutrition brand, let's circle back to how Eric Hillman performed over these last 10 months as MusclePharm CEO. One of the interesting things about the bankruptcy process is that even though MusclePharm no longer needs to file audited earnings reports to the SEC, they must submit monthly unaudited financial statements to the bankruptcy court. Maybe more interestingly, in that previous content, I laid out my 2023 revenue expectation for MusclePharm. You also have to consider that in 2021, the company had revenues of around $50 million. Now, that was when Costco basically amounted to over $2 million in monthly revenue. So if you strip that out, you also account for additional loss of revenue from deterioration of brand and mismanagement of inventory controls. You get about a $15 million business in 2023. That's realistically where MusclePharm is right now. Admittedly, this isn't a fair way to judge the Hillman MusclePharm CEO era because just keeping the lights on is literally a win, but it's still important data. So, how did he do, and how close was my prediction after only seeing January's putrid monthly revenue? In the first 7 months of 2023, MusclePharm had net sales of $7.9 million. That's below my prediction on an annualized average monthly revenue rate, but the last few months have been stronger, and that leads me to believe it would have slightly exceeded that $15 million threshold if forced to continue operating independently. More importantly, MusclePharm has kept its gross margins above 30% in 2023. My supplement industry professionals are probably scoffing at how poor that looks, but you have to remember that MusclePharm is basically a whey protein focused brand with no economies of scale, no negotiation power on the supply side, and no pricing power to consumers at this point. I also tossed in the legal fees into this kind of quick napkin math income statement that I built. I did this because if you strip out those insanely high expenses, you get an operationally profitable muscle farm. Let that sink in for a second because my longtime muscle farm followers know that this has been a struggle since the sports nutrition brand's inception. So, considering the shit situation and short leash provided to Eric Hillman, he did a great job. But Eric Hillman is also not a magician, and the muscle farm that was handed to him needed a lot. Muscle Farm has deteriorated significantly since the early 2010 golden years when I was a part of the sports nutrition brand's hyper growth phase. The fact is, the Muscle Farm of today is unrecognizable to the one that I left over a decade ago. On the business front, love him or hate him, after Brad Pyatt resigned, all of the vision for Muscle Farm left with him. The last 7-ish years or so at Muscle Farm has been filled with chasing off brand trends, totally wrecking any semblance of brand standards, and basically losing all emotional connection with its consumers. Where does that usually lead you? Serving the wrong master, aka chasing selling retail dollars. Without supporting the brand customer long term, eventually velocities start to slow, and you can even lose those placements altogether. So, the chance of getting back to the heyday of Muscle Farm, both from an influence impact and revenue perspective, is really a statistical anomaly. But even clawing back to the level of the last few years will be extremely tough. Here's the good news though. My hope for a strategic buyer that will be a shepherd to the Muscle Farm brand in the latter part of its life cycle looks like it will become a reality. A few days ago, the bankruptcy court approved the stalking horse bid with FitLife Brands Inc. for a purchase price of just over $18 million. Now, there's still some details that need to be worked out before you see this news spread across the press release news wires, but let's just assume it did happen. For some of you, that follow me across the different digital platforms, the supplement brand portfolio named FitLife Brands might ring a bell. And that's because I've talked about them many times prior. For those scratching their heads, FitLife Brands is a developer and marketer of over 150 different products under the brand names NDS Nutrition, PMD Sports, Isotory, Siren Labs, and a handful of others. Up until recently, FitLife Brands generated most of its revenue from the retailer GNC. The reason GNC no longer accounts for two-thirds or more of the total revenue is FitLife Brands finally did something earlier this year that I've been pleading for them to do since 2019, and that's to acquire a digital first brand to diversify its channel revenue mix. FitLife Brands did one better by acquiring a collection of three Amazon focused digital brands in the nutritional supplements and skincare categories under the corporate name Mimi's Rock. You might be wondering how I know all of this, and I forgot to mention that FitLife Brands is a publicly traded company with the stock ticker FTLF. Since we're on this subject, FitLife Brands also just got uplisted to NASDAQ last week, which should enhance the visibility of the company in the capital markets and improve the trading volume of its stock. What else would increase your company's visibility while also making a splash in the big leagues of capital markets? Acquire something flashy like a sports nutrition brand that used to have some of the brightest brand aesthetics in the industry. Regardless of how steep its downfall was, MusclePharm still has some juice left in its intellectual property, and I think this is especially true when it's in the hands of capable operators. Which brings me to the final part of this content. What's next for FitLife Brands? I'd like to bring up a previous clip from about 2.5 years ago where I stated FitLife Brands leadership continues to show that they can run a sound operational business, but I continue to fear that they need stronger visionary voices that can drive this business to being $100 million plus in top line revenue over the next 3 to 5 years. Two things I want to expand on. Firstly, there's a lot of change happening at FitLife Brands. You have two relatively major acquisitions that are happening within about 7 months. These moves will challenge the belief that FitLife Brands are sound operators because, for one, it takes the legacy business that did around $29 million in 2022 and supercharges it to about $75 million annually when you add about $30 million from Mimi's Rock and $15 million from MusclePharm. Moreover, Mimi's Rock, as mentioned previously, mostly deploys an Amazon sales channel strategy. While this channel diversification at FitLife Brands was needed, you must also understand the constantly evolving knowledge required to win on that marketplace is much different than being great at driving sales inside of a specialty supplement retailer. Then, at MusclePharm, it must contend with a product sales mix that's heavy on protein, which will more than likely result in an impact to the gross margins of FitLife Brands. But more than anything, MusclePharm will require a whole bunch of energy put towards turnaround efforts. The varied needs from these two acquisitions, and then any additional ones in the future, will challenge the FitLife Brands team to be strategically multidimensional. This will result in one of those make it or break it moments that prove my other previous stronger visionary voices needed point right or wrong. But only time will tell. And maybe Dayton Judd, FitLife Brands chairman and CEO, will take me up on my offer for some content together soon. I hope you enjoyed this YouTube video. If you did, consider hitting the like button to support me. Also, help me get to my new short-term goal of 3,000 subscribers by hitting that subscribe button. I'd love to see you join me on this journey, but we need to fix the fact that basically 80% of you that are watching this YouTube video right now are not subscribed to my channel, and that makes me extremely sad. But I do want to thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.